Hi folks, hope everyone is doing well. Today's video I want to talk about a particular aspect of the ongoing tensions between China and the West. I mean, there's no escaping it. That is the situation. And I think this is one area that requires a bit of discussion, or rather a look at. And that is this notion that the West is somehow jealous of China. And by the West, obviously, I mean the collective West, the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Western Europe, Australia, the West, and countries whose value systems are based on Western ideology. Um, so this has been a common sort of trope among Chinese nationalists. You see it online a lot, and you see it in other areas. That is to say, whenever an issue arises, well, of course there are many, a very common characteristic of the counter critique from Chinese nationalists is, oh, the West is just jealous, they are envious of our success. So what's this referring to? It's obviously referring to the fact that in the last sort of 15, 20 years, China's rise has been very impressive. I'm talking here not in moral terms, just in the factor terms. It has risen very fast. Its economy has grown very fast. It's got formidable military, certainly much more formidable than when Mao declared the People's Republic of China in 1949. Um, and now it's got its own space program, and again, quite a dominant one at that. So all these things sort of add up to a lot of national pride. I've long argued that the tool that the Communist Party uses today is not Marxism-Leninism per se. Sure, they officially teach it, and it's officially in the party constitution and so on. But I believe the real tool that the CCP uses is ultranationalism. And this has been going on for at least I would say 15 years, probably going back further than that. I mean, there's always been a nationalistic side to China, even before the communists took over in imperial China and during nationalist China, like de facto nationalist China, the Kuomintang era. China was always wary of outsiders. Now, Chinese nationalists may say, well, look at what happened. We were humiliated and exploited by the Europeans and the Japanese. Anyone who's looked at Chinese history will be familiar with the century of humiliation. This was a period beginning roughly with the Opium Wars and lasting up until the Xinhai Revolution of 1912, in which China basically was humiliated. There's no getting away from that. There was various conflicts, um, certainly some very bloody conflicts internally. The Taiping Rebellion, for example, which occurred from I believe it was 1854 to 1872, round about that period, coinciding with the American Civil War. That conflict, by some sources, is ranked as the bloodiest civil war in human history. Up to 20 to 25 million were killed. It was a major, major conflict, and it caused absolute breakdown in infrastructure, much like the Chinese Civil War of the 20th century did. Um, Now, officially, the European powers were backing the Qing dynasty against the Taiping rebels, but it was more sort of, arrangement of convenience rather than any sort of genuine alliance. But this is an example. So that happened for much of the 19th century. And I could certainly understand the early Chinese revolutionaries being resentful of that. They wanted to reclaim national identity, much like you got in all the countries that decolonized, right? I don't question that. I think it's totally understandable. They wanted to mark their own identity and show we could stand on our own feet. And we're no longer going to be exploited by the Europeans and the Japanese. Here's the problem, though. Chinese nationalists like to pretend the last 100 years haven't happened, and they want to go just focus and fixate on that century of humiliation. So they talk about the Opium Wars, for example. Now, the Opium Wars, we forced the drug onto the Chinese market, knowing that we could exploit its revenue. So to this day, Queen Victoria is a controversial figure in China. But if you look at the actual toll of the Opium Wars, I'm talking in conflict deaths here, they were relatively minor compared to the sort of bloodshed and chaos that occurred in the 20th century, and particularly under communism. Now, I get the argument there's a different dynamic from an outside invasion or an outside force versus internal strife, but there is definitely selectivity when it comes to Chinese assessments of history. In other words, anything that the communists done is kind of censored and glossed over, but when it comes to what the Europeans done, let's just keep reminding people of that. So it's very dishonest. Um, but it's important to look at that because that is kind of the justification for this mentality of well, the West just is jealous now because China has risen so fast. So there's many examples of this. A few years ago, Chinese Olympic swimmer Sun Yang was actually involved in a drug controversy. Um, Chinese nationals were saying it's just the jealous West trying to give him a bad name. But this guy had failed several drug tests. He actually had a tantrum and took the drug testing kit and smashed it on the ground. There's a video where he squared up to his Australian rival. I forget the guy's first name. Horton was his family name. But, there were a few rivals. There was a British guy as well. And this Chinese guy, very arrogant, very full of himself, and very, very unsportsmanlike. Now, when that video surfaced, this is probably about 3 or 4 years ago, his fanboys and fangirls were immediately saying, "Oh, the West is just attacking this guy because they're jealous." Um, but that's pathetic. The reason he was being criticised is because he was being unsportsmanlike. He was acting like a thug, not a professional sportsman. So that was the reason for the criticism, and also the fact that there were legitimate questions over how clean he was as a competitor. He had failed one drug test. That's just an example. This is not to say the West is squeaky clean. Certainly, there's been Americans who failed drug tests. I'm not suggesting there hasn't been. But, it's this sort of mentality of, well, it must be jealousy. You can see this in other areas as well. Whenever the BBC or CNN or other outlets raise issues about human rights, particularly what's going on in Xinjiang, um, the narrative that you get from Chinese state media is it's just a way of vilifying China. It's just a way of trying to make us look bad. I would counter they're so good at doing that themselves. There is nobody who does more to make China look bad than the CCP, with their extreme cruelty, with their track record of brutal human rights abuses, and their extreme jingoism. This is deeply, deeply entrenched in the current Chinese model, and you can see this. I mean, this is a point I've mentioned lots of times, they actively stoke up national sentiment in the diaspora. We have to be careful not to generalize Chinese people. That would be wrong. But it is irrefutable that you see this dynamic where you get mainland Chinese students who throw their weight around on Australian campuses, American campuses, British campuses. They think that they can, intimidate and threaten other students, particularly those from Hong Kong or those critical of the CCP. And they're basic bullies, but they're using this jingoism, this green light that they've got from Beijing to do so. I've long argued the West needs to be more assertive in areas like that, which supposedly falls under the domain of soft power. I mean, university shouldn't be a battleground, but what the CCP is doing is trying to undermine Western democracy. And I've long believed that they use our tolerance against us. Um, the double standards are profound. I mean, recently, Chinese state media tried to exploit the Canadian schools abuse scandal. Now, let me be clear, what happened in Canada was a disgrace, and it is a shameful record in Canada's history. The way those Indigenous children were treated, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and suicide, it was disgraceful, and that went right up to the 1990s. So it's not a small thing. It's a national shame for Canada. It's something Canada has to face, and there's been similar scandals in Australia. Both countries, as much as I love them, they have to face that and they have to accept that it is, something that they have to come clean about. Just like in Britain, we need to accept the excesses of the British Empire. and some of the crimes committed by the British Empire that are inexcusable. But here's the difference, and I think Justin Trudeau was right to point this out. When China was pointing fingers and trying to exploit this, they weren't doing so because they really care about Indigenous children. They were doing so simply to have a pop at Ottawa. That was it, and that's the only reason. Now, as Trudeau pointed out, where is the inquiry into the CCP's crimes? Where is the independent inquiry looking into what really happened at Tiananmen Square? Where's the inquiry into looking at the brutal torture of Falun Gong practitioners, the persecution of the Uyghur people, the subjugation of Hong Kong? You can honestly take pretty much anything that has happened in Western countries in recent years, multiply it by 10, and that would give you some scope of the depth of CCP crimes. Um, I absolutely say with 100% certainty that no political party in human history has done more to hurt its own people and cover it up than the Chinese Communist Party. I'm even including the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union is gone. The CCP is still here. So this whataboutery that CCP likes to engage in, it's just a facade. Because when they can say we acknowledge our problems, we acknowledge the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, we acknowledge that people were gunned down in Beijing and other cities in June 1989, then maybe they can play the whataboutery game. But there's simply no comparison. What will happen in Canada is there will be a comprehensive inquiry, there will be soul searching, there will be debate, there will be protests, there will probably be compensation. In fact, it's happened previously. That's the difference. The mothers who lost sons and daughters at Tiananmen Square have never got compensation. In fact, they've been threatened. So China has absolutely no right to point at any country until it starts coming clean about its own past. I just think it's incredibly hypocritical. But um, to get on to the issue of this narrative, oh, the West is jealous. Well, the preposition that the West is jealous, the accusation that the West is jealous would really need to require something to be jealous of, right? That's the basis of the argument. So, what would that jealousy lie in? The fact that China is, making its mark in space, its economy is growing fast, its military is powerful, and the only other country that's more powerful than China right now is the United States. France can't take on China alone, Britain can't take on China alone, Canada can't take on China alone, Australia can't take on China alone. So we get that. Individually, China, in that one on one situation, China is a formidable force. That's absolutely true. But as a British citizen, with all the problems we have in this country, with all the issues that are going on in the West right now, particularly around the culture wars, would I opt to live in China? The answer is still no. As a Westerner, I'm grateful to live in a country where I can freely criticise both my head of state and the head of government. I can criticise the Queen and nothing will happen to me. I can criticise Boris Johnson and nothing will happen to me. Why would I be jealous of a situation where if I criticise Emperor Qi, I get a knock on the door for state subversion? There's just no comparison. Because this actually gets into an interesting dynamic, which is another side to China. It's this kind of quasi-capitalist materialism. It's actually very materialistic. I've been there, I've seen it. That is to say that the values of a country should somehow be marked on its wealth alone. Now, one could argue this is a Western import. America could be very consumerist and materialistic. It's one of my critiques, actually, of the United States. And because America is the world superpower, we all sort of get a bit of that to some extent. To break this down a bit, people talk about who has the best car or who has the best smartphone or whatever it is. So this materialistic thing you can sometimes see in China. Um, but it's a facade ultimately, because a country that doesn't have values, a country that relies on power alone, is doomed to failure ultimately. So China's bargaining chip at the moment is only its power. And that is it. And that's not something to trivialize. It's formidable. It's for real. And it is very possible in the next 10 years it might even surpass the United States. China might indeed become the world hegemony. I think it's very conceivable in the next decade. Um, but ultimately, I think that a system is based on power and control alone will ultimately fail because at some point, those cracks that are in Chinese society will start to get wider and wider. I mean, right now, Beijing is very confident because they have iron control on the people. Xi Jinping, when he spoke to that 70,000 mob, um, and he threatened to smash the heads of foreigners who interfere, is that really the mark of confidence? Or is it the mark of, well, basically the bully pulpit? And I think that actually the problems that are in Chinese society, and there are a lot of problems, state media might not show it, Global Times and so on, well-off students who can afford to go to Western countries, they will never talk about it. But those problems do exist. For example, there is very real tensions in rural China over development projects between, for example, villagers and construction companies that are state owned. In some cases, for example, you get ancestral burial grounds are bulldozed over to create new development, and the government pays people off, but it doesn't change the anger. Um, I've long believed that if there's going to be a revolution in China, it won't be because people suddenly feel sorry for Hong Kongers or Uyghurs, as awful as that is. Um, it will be more bread and butter issues. The average Chinese, unfortunately, still believes that everything that is out there about the Uyghurs is all Western propaganda. They just don't believe it. And they believe everything that Emperor Xi and the CCP tells them, that these concentration camps are necessary because it's collective punishment, because there were some terrorist incidents like the knife attack at Kunming. Therefore, that's okay. We can, punish every Uyghur, and they wrap up the lies because never underestimate the power that a dictatorship has to brainwash people and to indoctrinate people. It is very, very intense. So even someone who is intelligent and I was going to say educate, but then the question is what sort of education do you have? But even someone who's intelligent, I've seen Chinese people or I've come across Chinese people who are decent people. They're helpful, they're generous, they love their family, they work hard, they're decent people, but they still will stand by CCP propaganda because it is so deeply entrenched. It's really so powerful, and that propaganda is based foremost on nationalism. So even people who will say that they're not for the CCP, they will still be defensive and nationalistic. They'll get very worked up by this and they'll say, oh, but we do criticize the government. But then they will conflate criticism of the CCP with criticism of China. They don't see the difference. And I guess in one sense, the CCP has iron control. So these days, in at least that sense, China is transferable with the CCP in the sense of geopolitics. We could argue that people like me who have been there can say, well, yeah, there is another China. There's a culture. There's, people getting on with their lives. There's a lot of good things there. But the CCP has an iron grip. So unfortunately, they kind of are transferable with China in that sense. And obviously, in geopolitics, when we talk about China, we are talking about the Chinese government in the context of geopolitics. So, but I think we need to push back against this idea that we're jealous. We're assertive and we're wary and we're concerned. And we might even get angry at the arrogance and the double standards. But the last thing I believe the West is jealous. Now, you could argue that there's pressure on Joe Biden to make sure China doesn't take over domestically. I mean, he's already been branded Beijing Biden by the Republicans, which in my view is an unfair smear, one that has very little basis in fact. I mean, the Biden administration has taken a hardline approach with Beijing. They designated the persecution of the Uyghurs as genocide. they've imposed sanctions. This notion that Biden is soft on China, I don't think adds up. But and I think it comes from just the fact he has a different style, a different persona from Trump. But I think actually, when it comes to China, Biden has been tough. Um, but domestically, you could argue politicians have pressure because they need to show that they're standing up to China, and I think they should. But in terms of jealousy, you might even argue. I mean, George W. Bush once made a flippant comment: "It would be much easier to be a dictator," or something along those lines. Now, Bush wasn't literally saying, "I want to be a dictator," but it was, one of the many Bushisms. It sounded like he was jealous of dictators for having that power. Trump, on the other hand, I think might well be capable of that jealousy. But, someone like Xi Jinping, he might well be a lifetime president. He might even die in office. But how will history record Xi? Who knows? Some might say he was a Chinese patriot who stood up to the West, made China's economy strong, and made its military strong. But depending on things that happen in this century, I do think we're going to see some very profound events. Take, for example, if China decides to reclaim Taiwan by force. Now, let's say that happens. The United States will be obligated to defend Taiwan, and it's very hard to imagine that Japan and Australia and the UK will just stay out of that. So there'll be an armed conflict. God forbid, but this is very plausible. So then the pressure will really be on Xi to prevail. All the hot talk, all the jingoism, the artificial islands, all of it, he'll have something to prove. And if China was to lose such a conflict, which is 50-50, we don't know what could happen. But if it did, then I think public opinion would turn against Xi Jinping. Something like that could happen. You could find that social problems within China grow and grow because a rising economy, and actually the Chinese economy slowed down somewhat, but even, Chinese people might not necessarily be content with that. People might start to think, well, actually, maybe there is a problem here. Maybe we should be allowed more room to dissent. Maybe we should be allowed to protest. They might start asking these questions, and they won't necessarily be wanting to replicate the West, but those questions will start to be asked more and more. So what I'm saying is, at the moment, I think the power is real. I don't underestimate it, but I also think that it's covering up some cracks that might get deeper or wider, and it will be interesting to see what transpires. I'm not going to lie, this is an uncertain time for the West in many areas. In Britain, we're still waiting to see really whether Brexit was ultimately the right decision or not. I think it's too early to tell. There are questions on our constitutional issues. There's questions over, for example, Scotland and the very framework of this United Kingdom. These are serious questions. The future of the monarchy is a serious question. There are big, big question marks in our society and our country. In the United States and the UK and other Western countries, the culture wars is an ever burning question. And again, that's something that Russia and China lap up. Russia does as well, because if you look at the way RT reports on these things, RT loves anything to do with wokeism or the culture wars because it gives them an opportunity to point fingers at the West. And I would argue they're doing it not because they really care, but just because it scores them political points. Because frankly, you don't see that sort of situation going on in China and Russia. And it might, I hate to say this, but it might be one area where they have a strength because in China, you don't get the same dynamic. I mean, you'll get people arguing over Chinese pop, right? I mean, you do get debates in China that are not politically related, debates over the love lives of celebrities, very much like gossip anywhere in the world, right? So you do get that dynamic. Um, and you also get a thing about, for example, recently there was a man who was reunited with his son. It was a great story. This guy had spent years searching for his kidnapped son, and he prevailed. There was even a film made about it starring Andy Lau, and that was a great outcome. But that's the sort of thing Chinese people will debate about now. In the West, we're really, really divided on issues like basically around the culture wars. Over microaggressions, over white privilege, over all that crap. And I do think it weakens us. I think it's a problem. And I think there needs to be a pushback against it. I think we need to return to common sense. Um, So I can see that being something weakening not just Britain and the United States and Canada, but also Europe, because you're seeing this in Western Europe as well. And I don't think it's an asset. I think it weakens us because I think that Russia and China take advantage of that. Certainly, when we get incidents like English football hooligans behaving in a way that embarrasses us as a nation, that's not good for PR. Police brutalities, not good for America's PR. Recently, I was looking at one of my old students, and all over her Weibo, there was pictures of George Floyd and the riots in the United States last year. So these sort of things are the sort of things that will be exploited. It doesn't matter that the man who killed George Floyd is now in jail, and the United States had rigorous debate over this, and American citizens could freely debate the issues. But the West is flawed. We need to address our own problems. Um, I'm not saying we need to address our own problems before we can talk about the human rights situation in China, because I don't think it's comparable. But nevertheless, we do need to address these problems. So anyway, I'll round this up, but jealousy is just something that I think is a false narrative, because what do the Chinese have? They have more disposable income, perhaps better living standards than the past, but they've got no free speech. They know that if they step out of line, they will get a police knock on the door for subverting state power. So is material wealth worth that sort of control? Actually, on a much, much smaller scale, I've always argued this about the situation in Singapore. Singapore is a very wealthy country and very clean. It's got gleaming skyscrapers. But a friend of mine, or I can't say she's a close friend, but I'm connected with her, Melissa Chen, is a prominent. She's now an American citizen, I believe, but she's a journalist, and she left Singapore over some of their draconian rules. So I would argue that's an example of a sort of facade. And this is not about bashing Singapore. I'm sure Singapore is a great place, but the impression I've always got is that the clean streets and the gleaming skyscrapers and the wealth kind of hides an authoritarianism that is there. Not comparable to China, but it's an example. I don't believe that materialism can ultimately mask control and authoritarianism, because without democracy, without freedom of speech, you've got no starter. As for the idea of Chinese democracy, it's a laugh. I mean, it's a bad joke. This idea that you even hear from Chinese communists that it's a form of democracy because it's the people's will, but the people don't have a choice. So it's not a choice. It's just a completely false argument. Um, I remember having a rather tense debate with I thought she was a friend, really. She was an acquaintance. But in Shanghai, of all places, I was right there, and I had this debate. And she tried telling me that there is the dissent and there's different political parties in China. The reality is there are smaller parties, but they're all under the umbrella of communism. So they're not really separate political parties. It's subsidiaries of the Communist Party. But jealousy, I've lived in both countries. I've lived in the United Kingdom and I've lived in China. I had some very good memories in China. I miss it sometimes. But would I choose to live there long term? Absolutely not. Even with all the good memories I had, with the friends I miss, with all of that, I would not choose to live there because I would not want to live in a society where I really have to be careful what I'm saying all the time. In the West, we may be challenged in this regard, particularly over laws that may well impact free speech, disguised as hate crime legislation. And this is why there has to be a pushback against what I believe is causing this totalitarian tendency, and a lot of it is wokeism. But there has to be pushback. So I don't think the West is at that stage yet, but we can never be complacent. But jealousy? No, I'm not jealous. I'm aware, I'm assertive, and sometimes I'm angry about it. I'm not jealous.